This place has welcomed travelers for generations, where journeys of hope began, where survivors found sanctuary, live stories of courage in the darkest times, of ordinary people choosing to be extraordinary. This is Hear My Story.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Hear My Story with my special guest, Monique Rothschild. Monique, thank you so much for being with me today, and I'm excited to jump into your story. We've been friends for so many years.
A long time now.
And I've learned so much about your story, and I can't wait for other people to also learn from you today. So first off, most of your story takes place in France, but before we get there, I want to get a sense of who your parents were and where they came from. Will you tell us a little bit about their background?
Sure. So my parents were both from Germany. My mother was from northern Germany, from Hamburg, and my father was from Frankfurt, which is more in the south. So I thought I had a hamburger and a Frankfurter for parents, and that was pretty cool. They didn't like it, but I thought it was funny. And so they both went to school in Germany, received excellent educations. My father was quite a bit older than my mother, so he actually was in World War I as a soldier for the Kaiser, as was my grandfather. So my father and my grandfather were both in the Kaiser's army, and my grandfather was a pharmacist, and he was stationed in either Belgium or France, I'm not sure.
And both of your parents both leave Germany in May of 1933.
May 1st.
May 1st, same date.
The same day. They didn't know each other. My mother was in school as a university student, and well, the writing was on the wall in more ways than one when teachers and students alike were wearing Nazi armbands and discriminating against Jewish students, and Jewish faculty had to leave the university. So my mother left and she was at the University of Frankfurt, and she left and went home to Hamburg and tried to persuade her parents to leave with her. And she had 3 sisters, and her father called her a dirty communist and said, I fought in the war and I have a business and life is good here and you can go, but you can't have any money and we're not going with you. So my mother was 19 and pretty brave soul. She struck out on her own for Paris. My father was a journalist with a byline in a lot of prominent liberal left-leaning newspapers, and had some unfavorable comments to make about Hitler very early on. And so very early on, he was on a list of journalists and other undesirables. And so he had false papers, and he left also on May 1st, crossing the border at Saarbrücken, saying he was going to attend a businessman's conference. I mean, my father knew nothing about business. He was just an intellectual, but he was on his way to a business conference, and then he just crossed the border with what he could take for a night.
Wow. And how did your parents meet in France?
Well, it's a little unclear. They told me a story that I thought could not be true until I saw a French film made in the 30s that actually had this scenario. So my father said that my mother walked into a cafe, a bar, with a couple of friends, and he was sitting at the bar with his friends, and he saw this pretty young thing go by, and he bet his friends that if he asked her out, she would say yes. And she did. She said yes. And right, they were together ever after. She was only about 20 years old at the time, and he was in his late 30s.
Wow. What an amazing meeting. And then, so here they are in France. They've met, they've fallen in love. they're in their safe haven, right? They both left Germany
Right.
separately, but then their safe haven changed in
Well-
1939. Can you tell us a little bit
Well,
about that?
a little bit before that,
Sure.
is that they felt safe in France for a while, but there was still no way for my father to really earn a living. He was a writer, and German was his language. And it took years before his French was good enough. So he made money as a tutor of German, and he did what he could. And then there was an organization called, I forget exactly, but something like the Guild for German Writers in Exile. And it had offices in London and New York, and it helped either to get writers out of France or to help them financially. And my father was the kind of executive secretary of that organization, helping other writers. So, I didn't know that about him until a few years ago, but I mean, to me, that was pretty heroic. Meanwhile, my mother had heard about the Montessori method of education, and she went to Nice in the south of France, knowing nobody, to take a course so she could become a Montessori teacher, which she did. And so she taught, and my father did what he could do.
Wow. And then how did their situation change then in
Well, the
1939?
situation changed in 1939 when France and England declared war on Germany. And all of a sudden, all the Germans, many of whom were Jewish, who were in France were considered undesirables, enemy aliens, non désirables. And the men were, in the winter of 1939, were made to report to collection centers and were shipped off to labor camps.
And what about your mother at this
So
time?
my mother, of course, was frantic, and she was in Paris and working and taking French lessons. I think it was either because her father insisted or the French government insisted, but she was always a student because that was the only way her father could send her money, an allowance, so to speak. So she remained a student up till the day she left Paris at the Alliance Française. And where were we? Oh, yeah. So they were separated. And then he came, for some reason, and I don't know why, they let everybody out of the camps. And for a couple of months, and my father hurried back to Paris. And my mother discovered she was pregnant, and they were married. And the day after their wedding, he had to report again to another collection center, at which point my mother totally lost contact with him, and she was pregnant.
And you tell an interesting story that your mom did not, she was actually sent away from a camp because she was pregnant.
Well,
right?
no, I don't want to go into that because I don't really have facts, so I can't back it up. There was a notorious camp that mostly had women, was in the southwest of France called Gurs, Gurs, and the conditions there were frightful. And my mother says she went there, but I don't have any paperwork. I have no documentation, so I've become a historian, so unless I have documentation, I'm not sure. But she said because she was pregnant, the guards let her go. They took but I find that so hard to believe because Gurs was notorious. There was so much sickness and death there. But she says she was there.
Well, then I know that your parents do eventually reunite in Bellac, but then why is Bellac also significant to your story?
So my mother then started, as you missed the Germans occupying France.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so it wasn't just that the Germans had been rounded up by the French and put in camps because they were enemy aliens, but then the Nazis invaded France. And when they went into Paris, it's very famous. It's called the Exodus or the Exode, and it's reportedly the largest exodus of people out of one area into another, which is hard to imagine because we have these refugee problems today with huge numbers of people being displaced. But as the Germans went through the Low Countries, Holland, Belgium, all of those people were fleeing the Nazis and fled through northern France. And this exodus, the roads were clogged with thousands and thousands of people just trying to get out. The Germans closed the trains, so there was really no way to go. And my mother hitched a ride, pregnant and scared as she was. Well, I don't know if she hitched, but she was offered a ride with a stranger. And she went to the Basque country because she'd heard a rumor. Rumors were everywhere that my father was there and he wasn't. And then by happenstance, one day she found out where my father was. And she bravely and very pregnantly took the train to this little town, not knowing if he'd still be there when she got there. But he was. And so that's where I was born.
In Bellac.
In Bellac.
And they were reunited there?
Yes.
In the camp, or was he?
So that's also unclear. I think that he had permission to live in the house of the mayor. And another family also lived there. So I don't know how much time he actually spent at the camp, but perhaps once I was born, he was able to come and stay in the village with my mother. I don't think it means he didn't have to do any work in the labor camp. I just think he was able to be with my mother and with me.
And you bring up the Mayor Desbordes, right?
Mayor, oh, you have a good memory, Mayor Desbordes, right?
And he also plays a pretty significant role in this story. Can you tell us why he is so special, I guess?
Well, he really risked his life befriending the Jews who were in the camp. But funny thing, in this town, they had concerts that were jointly with musicians from the camp and musicians from the town. And they were to raise money for the Secours National, sort of like a national help. I don't know how to translate it better, but to help families. And so there were these concerts, and the people who were in the camp, which was outside the town up a steep hill, were there. They were either there as musicians or as audience, and really speaks to the importance of music in trying to soothe people's anxieties. They must have been very important to my mother because she saved 3 programs of all. She couldn't bring anything with her to the States, but she saved 3 programs. And but he did. He took a big chance in a nearby town. The mayor was drawn and quartered in the public square for helping Jews to escape. And a town very close to the town where I was born was burnt to the ground by the Nazis because the people in that town were resistors, résistance. And, so he took it's a long story. I won't go, everything's a long story. But at one point, my mother had to leave France, and my father had been arrested again and sent to a disciplinary camp. And Monsieur Desbordes and the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which was very active in France at that time, helped my father to get out of France and into Spain, where my mother was.
And that's where they again were reunited.
They were again reunited. I mean, it was only because the boat for which they had tickets kept being delayed. So my mother was there with a brand new baby and thinking she had to leave because she had to save my life. But my father ended up meeting her there. It was just, I think, a miracle.
Is this the part of the story where your mother carried you through the Pyrenees?
Well, she said she walked, this is what she told me. I walked across the Pyrenees carrying you. I don't know. Again, I don't have any documentation. It's kind of, I don't know. It adds drama to the story if you think in terms of this woman carrying a suitcase and a baby, but I don't think it was quite like that. I think she probably was with a guide. There may have been other people escaping France who were being helped across the Pyrenees. I'm pretty certain they must have walked because my father took the train, but it was very dangerous. The platforms were patrolled by Franco's soldiers who were sympathetic to the Nazis and by the Nazis. And so it was very dangerous to take the train. So I have a feeling my mother did walk, but I'm not sure she walked all by herself.
Right. But with that story is really amazing, and the bravery and the perseverance,
It is.
right? And so I always appreciate when you do share that part of the story, because it really is
Heroic.
telling us,
It's
here's this woman
heroic.
who
I mean, I don't know that I would have done that, you don't know what you're going to do under duress, ever.
Right.
But my mother was Superwoman.
That's an excellent way of putting it. A baby, she's hoping to be reunited with her husband.
No,
so-
I think she'd given up hope of being reunited with him.
Mm.
She was just going to take this boat.
But then they are reunited
And they
there.
are reunited.
And speaking of the boat, will you tell us a little bit
I can.
about the Navamar or the
I will.
Nevermore and the journey to America?
So it's easy to kind of glamorize hardships by making them sound so full of drama, but this ship really was a horror story. It was a freighter. It was an old freighter. It had 6 holds for cargo, and it had a captain's living quarters and probably living quarters for a dozen or more crew members. But it wasn't prepared for 2,000 people. And it was a nightmare. The people who were on the boat called it a floating gourz, referring back to that terrible camp for women. Some people called it the Nevermore instead of the Navamar. And the women and children were in 6 holds, 4 holds, and the men were in 2 holds. And there were bunks that were kind of against the walls and up the middle of the room. And there were no sanitary conditions, and the food was, when we see a movie set in a prison and people are being fed slop, that's kind of what it was. So I don't even know how my mother kept me alive. I really don't. She never, the only thing she ever said was that she went to the kitchen to get water, and that it was guarded by a big man with a big knife, but he took pity on her and he gave her drinking water because there was no drinking water. So I can only surmise that she had powdered baby food for me, like powdered milk or powdered something that she could stir with drinking water. And she apparently helped other mothers. And she also wrote once that that I was a very friendly baby, and so she could just kind of hand me off to anybody, and and I would go with them, and they would take me up on deck, and but my mother was very, very sick on that boat, and she probably hardly ever got to see my father, and they and many of the other passengers, just these conditions were unbelievable. They'd grown up in upper middle class homes. They were fastidious. My father was always very dapper, always wore a three-piece suit and a Homburg and, a hat. It's a hat. And my mother looked elegant in suits. And I mean, they never talked about it. My father wrote something about it that I only discovered years after both of my parents were dead. And he said it was the worst thing about the whole trip, the whole leaving Germany, trying to adapt to life in France, being in 6 different labor camps. He said the ship was the worst. And people died on that ship, including the mother of a woman in Cincinnati. So it was about as bad as it could get.
And they arrived in 1941. I know a lot of passengers were actually hospitalized because of how ill they were. Were your parents?
So I want to back up a minute. Sure. Again. Hundreds of people. The ship first went to Bermuda, and people who were sick were taken, the most sick, the people at death's door. Some people had died at sea and were thrown overboard, but some people were taken off the ship in Bermuda, and the women and the children could get off the ship, and they were handed oranges and candy. Then they got back on the ship, and then the ship went on to Cuba. And by prior arrangement, several hundred people got off in Cuba. But the representative of the Jewish agency, who was there to supervise these immigrants, saw what the conditions were, and he wired New York. And after that, the ship had to carry a quarantine flag. And I have no pictures of it, but I've gone online. It looks like a yellow flag with a skull and bones. There are a lot of different varieties of a quarantine flag. But it was not allowed to land originally at Ellis Island. It landed in Brooklyn, and inspectors came on board and medical professionals came on board, and they allowed some people to get off. And then some people were quarantined on Ellis Island, including my parents. But we fortunately were only there for 3 days, but other people were there for quite a bit longer. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know, having had a child, I don't know how my mother managed with a baby. I wasn't a year old. So if you think of a child's developmental stages, I was probably crawling. Now, how could I have crawled on that boat? And how would I have crawled in it must have seemed very clean at Ellis Island, at least. I guess I could crawl there. But I can't even imagine having this baby. And my mother developed goiter. Do you know what that is? Mm-hmm. So she developed a goiter on the ship. And so she was pretty sick. And my father hadn't been well to start with, so. But I was a very cute, chubby baby, and everybody loved holding me, I guess.
And a friendly baby.
A friendly baby.
You're still friendly.
So I think I made it as easy as I possibly could have made it for them.
So they arrived in late 1941. You said that they only stayed in New York for 3 days.
No, they stayed on Ellis Island.
On Ellis Island for 3 days.
So my mother her oldest sister was already in New York. And they may have stayed with, again, I don't have documentation. They may have stayed with Inga for a little bit, but my Aunt Inga had just had a baby. So my cousin Ingrid was about 2 weeks old, and I was 10 months old. So I think that in a small, dingy apartment in the Lower East Side. So I do have a letter that was addressed to my father at a hotel in Gramercy Park. So all I can think of is that my father's relatives, not my mother's sister, my father's relatives in New York had money, and maybe they paid for that, or maybe Hayes paid for refugees to stay someplace until they could get settled. I'm not sure. I just have this one letter that was addressed to my dad. So I've gone to that address and taken photographs, of course. They weren't very good photographs, so but I've taken photographs. And then my father had cousins in Cincinnati, and they came, or one of them anyway, came to New York. And she described Cincinnati as this cute small town. And my mother her nerves were shot. She was totally frazzled by her experiences in Europe and on the boat. She thought, that's where we're going. Nice small town, sounds like Bellac, which had 2,000 people.
So when they got to Cincinnati, what was life like here in Cincinnati? What did they end up doing?
Well, first of all, like many people, and why the Holocaust Center is here, we must have arrived by train. Again, I have no documentation, but since my mother and I took the train every summer to New York to see her sister, I'm going to assume we got here on the train. Well, we certainly didn't fly, and we surely didn't drive, so we took the train. And I have childhood memories of the train station being full to the brim with soldiers, because we would get on the train to go to New York and just no place to sit. Anyway, what was your question?
Well, actually, now I have another question. So do you remember, I'm going to come back to that one because that's a very interesting question that you remember soldiers. But what was their life like in the early days of settling here in Cincinnati?
So there was a lot of hardship, but I keep always reminding myself that the important thing was that they were alive. They had a roof over their heads, and they had food, and they had me. And so my mother's English was probably already pretty good. They had to learn English in school, I'm sure. My father's English never was so great, so I'm thinking that when we first got here, it really wasn't great at all. And some families welcomed refugees, their refugee relatives, with open arms and found them good jobs or bought them a little house, but that wasn't our situation. So we lived in a small apartment, and my father had a job as a janitor. And his health was so poor, and that could only have made it even worse. So he went to school. And took night school classes in bookkeeping. It was very far from being a music and drama critic and art critic, but he took classes in bookkeeping and ended up with a job as a teller at a bank in our neighborhood. My mother tried her hand at selling clothes, and she was not very good at it, though she did tell her interviewer that you had to use a lot of psychology being a saleswoman. I thought that was interesting, and I think she was my role model, so that no matter how menial the jobs were that I had, I always tried to find something interesting, something to make it fun for me so I didn't go stir crazy. And I think that's something I inherited from her. And then 1943, so we'd been here a couple of years. She found a job as a nursery school teacher at the Jewish Community Center, so she got to do what she'd been trained for. But meanwhile, what was life like? My parents had arrived on a 6-month visitor's visa. It was not any kind of a permanent visa. So I understand what people are going through now. We had a 6-month visitor visa. Every 6 months, we had to appear at the Department of Justice, which means the federal building downtown, the Department of Immigration and Naturalization Services, the INS, to reapply. And then at one point in 1943, they were told they could get a permanent visa, but they would have to leave the country to do it. And so they went overnight with me to Canada, to Windsor, to the consulate, so they could re-enter. And I think that had to be among the most scary moments of this entire episode in their lives. Could they get back? Would they be sent back to Germany? What was going to happen to them? They must have been really scared. And the only reason I'm for sure about that is that I remember being crying and being difficult. I was only 2.5, but I have a memory of it, that I was miserable the whole time. And, but we did come back and we did have a permanent visa, and that sort of nightmare was over. And then they had to wait, 8 years before 5 years before they could apply for citizenship.
And by then the war would have been over. You mentioned remembering seeing soldiers, and I'm curious if you remember the end of the war.
Oh, do I remember the end of the war? Well, I kind of do, because we lived on a terrific street in South Avondale. We lived in a small apartment building. There were 18 apartments, maybe 20, because we lived in 3 different apartments in the same building that had 20 apartments in it. And there were single family houses and 2 family houses and a couple of other small apartment buildings. But I can remember the noise in the street. Because it was such an unusual situation to have all of a sudden people go running out of their homes and into the street and screaming and yelling. And there were 2 children in the building, both my age, and we're still friends. But one of them said that what he remembered, he told me this a couple of years ago, what he remembered was people beating on pots and pans with wooden spoons. Now, I don't have that memory. I just remember a lot of noise and a lot of shouting and a lot of celebration. But I also remember that my mother had migraine headaches. And of course, as I learned later, it took a while to find out what had happened to both sets of grandparents, went to Auschwitz ultimately. And it took a while to find out what had happened to them. So, I think every minute of every day from the time they arrived in the United States until they got the word was filled with anxiety. My father had a great sense of humor, was a very loving and kind person, so I never noticed anything about him. My mother, I know, was always tense, and she tended to be a disciplinarian. I don't know that that's the right word, but she was strict with me. And I think it all grew out of anxiety, that I could be taken away. Anything could end in a minute. And I don't know if that's common to Holocaust survivors, but I'm sure it is, that you could lose it all in an instant. And the anxiety that must have provoked, I'm sure, colored their early years and my childhood.
And your mother, I know very much, because I also see this in you, values education. And so you said that your mom started in teaching
She started teaching at the Jewish Community Center in the nursery school. And she must have been very good at what she did, because then she was asked by the Council of Jewish Women, which had a project. They used to have startup projects, and they would provide volunteers and seed money. And then 3 years later, they'd move on to another significant project. So they started a project, the first in the country, a nursery school for children with cerebral palsy. And as a result of her teaching there, they found scholarship money for my mother, and she went in the summers to Syracuse University without an undergraduate degree to get a master's degree in special ed. And apparently the professor at Syracuse in special ed was like the leader in the country. I looked him up a few years ago online, and a very, very famous man, left Syracuse, went to my alma mater, the University of Michigan, little plug. And, but that was hard on me and hard on my father, because I had to be in charge from the time I was 12 to 16. I was in charge of my dad, who was loving and funny and pretty useless in the house. So I paid the cleaning lady, I paid the laundry man, I paid the milkman. I had these little envelopes with little amounts of money that I got every week that I used to pay for the groceries, did the cooking, tried to have fun in the summer, but then came home and took care of my father. But my mother she was very smart. She also was very ambitious. She wouldn't have said so, but I'm pretty sure she was an ambitious person. And she wasn't going to just let the grass grow under her feet. And if she could get a master's, she was going to get a master's. And because she got a master's, many years and many other startup jobs later, she was able to teach at Xavier University. So, she did what she needed to do.
Is this when the master's program was developed for Montessori method?
Right. She started that program.
It's amazing. Ambitious. I think
she was. I'm not sure she would have liked to use that word about herself, but you have to have a certain amount of ambition, I think, from my old age now, looking back at my own life, such as it is. You have to have a certain amount of ambition to accomplish what she accomplished.
And I think you know a lot of this story because you have done a lot of research, but
I have.
And you have some memories of at a very young age, but there's a particular time in your life where you started asking questions. And I love when you share this story. Can you tell us when that you first started asking about?
So I'm sure I first started asking questions when I was little, like, where are your sisters? Or I knew I had cousins because we took the train in the summer to New York, and gradually my Aunt Inga had more children, and I was the oldest, still am. And then my mother's youngest sister came from England, where she had been sent on kinder transport. She came from England to New York. She got married. She had children. So I had a lot of cousins in New York. But, if I tried to ask questions, like we all do, where did you go to school? I'm making it up. I don't know. But I must have asked questions like that. And whenever I asked a question, this veil just came over, and she'd get this look on her face. You don't want to do that to your mother. You don't want to be the cause of that expression on her face. But when I was a junior in high school, I don't know if it was just Walnut Hills or if it was all the schools in the city, but in the junior year, we had to write an autobiography. And my teacher said, I do not want a chronological. I was born on this date, and then I went to this elementary school, and then I went to that summer camp. And he didn't want a chronology. He said, I want you to think about something significant about your life and write about that. So I'm 16 years old, and as far as I know, nothing in my life is very significant. And as I do when I need to think, I took a walk. And in the course of my walk, I decided the most important thing in my life was that I was alive, because I did know that my parents were immigrants. By that time, I did know that there'd been a war in Europe. I did know a little, not much. Parents didn't talk about it, Didn't talk about it in Sunday school either. But I knew there'd been a war, and I knew that Jews had been killed. So I decided the most important thing was that I was alive. And at that point, my mother or father, one of them or both of them, showed me a newspaper clipping from the New York Times that said, "Horror ship lands in New York," and described the conditions on the ship. And I was stunned. But after that, we didn't talk about it anymore. But at least it gave me something to write about. But when I think about it, it was so fun. I was so naive. I tried to write this defense of being an all-American girl. I mean, I'm not sure that's what I strive for anymore. I'm not sure it's ever in my adult life that I've striven to be an all-American girl. But I wrote in my article in my paper how I liked hot dogs and was as American as the next person, wanting to fit in. That whole immigrant thing of wanting to fit in. But that's when I learned that. And again, as I said, that's as far as it went. I have since found other newspaper clippings that they didn't show me. And in one of the newspaper clippings, the captain of the ship said, "I think everybody enjoyed the trip very much." Nonetheless, he was sued by about half of the passengers afterwards. And I don't know the outcome of the lawsuit. My parents didn't participate. I don't know if they were able to sue the shipping company and get any money or what, but he thought that the passengers had enjoyed the trip.
Wow.
People will say and do anything.
Yeah. Well, and also, I'm not sure whether that report sparked your love of writing and research and things like that. No.
I was an English major. I still have every paper I wrote in high school and college. I wrote voluminously. I didn't write short stories or poems like a lot of girls did, but for school, I wrote, and I took it very seriously. I majored in English and had to do more writing in college. And almost every job I've had some kind of writing to do, whether it was articles or grants for funds or whatever. I've just always written.
But between writing, and I know you've also gone back to Europe a few times, what have you been able to learn that you didn't initially know? And I know you just went to France as of 2025.
And Germany.
And if I can add, it's almost a two-part question. Tell us about some of those experiences going back and retracing. But then you also mentioned that Mayor de Board was drawn and quartered.
No.
No.
The mayor in the next town.
Next town, sorry.
I said he took a great risk. Yeah. No, I knew him quite well.
Well, then tell us what happened to Mayor de Board so we know what happened. And did you ever see him again?
When he was no longer the mayor, he and his wife moved out of the town of Bellac to a family farm about half an hour away. And he became the mayor of this even smaller town. He was a marvel. A lot of the French, I don't know about my generation, but in my parents' generation, the French people I knew, very philosophical, loved to talk philosophy, loved to talk politics, loved to talk literature. And I always remember when my ex-husband and I went to France together, and Monsieur de Board took my husband for a walk, and he was talking about literature, and then he'd say, "Et puis vous avez," and then you have, and he'd go talking about another philosopher or another French author. And Roger said, "You should walk along nodding," because he didn't speak any French at all. But Monsieur de Board just talked away. And the first time I went to visit them, I didn't speak any French either. I had to start all over. So after college graduation, I went back to France and went to the Alliance Française like my mother and studied French. But on more recent trips, I've been more serious about looking for information. So the Shoah Memorial in Paris, which is a large institution. There were many Jews living in France. Paris had a large Jewish population. And of course, a lot of people were deported from France, like my father's parents who had come to France. They were deported from Paris to Auschwitz. So I went to do some research at the Shoah Memorial. That was pretty shocking. You know, they see a piece of paper that actually has my grandparents' names and the number of the convoy that took them away from Paris to Auschwitz. And go, that was pretty scary. This more recent trip, not only got beyond those pieces of paper that were in their archives, I got the actual thing, the actual card with each of their names on it, and some numerals and letters, and apparently that indicated they were to be killed as soon as they got there because they were so old. And I found a record of my father's release from this final prisoner hard labor camp and who helped him to get out. So, you know, now I ask on all of my subsequent visits, ever since I went with my son when I was so young. I was only 65 when we went. But since then, I've learned to ask a lot of questions, and I get more information every time I go.
And it's been quite a journey for you to put the story together. Were you forthcoming with sharing this with your children?
I have one child. I have no children. I have one children.
With Josh.
With Joshua. Oh, yes. And I think he's very cognizant of the fact that he is the grandson of survivors and the great-grandson of people who we think were wonderful people, but we don't know because we didn't know them. But he's very conscious of it. And he didn't know my father, but he knew my mother, and he loved her a lot. And she was very playful and loving with him. So he has great memories of his Yaya. And yeah, he doesn't ask a lot of questions, but if I talk, he listens.
And sometimes that's the most important
Yeah.
thing. Well, I'm so grateful to you for spending this time with me and sharing you and your family's story.
Oh,
And
my
I'm
pleasure.
wondering, what's one thing you hope that for the folks who tune in and watch this episode, what do you hope they take away from your story?
Well, I think the same thing they take away from any survivor's history is that it's not what you planned to do with your life, but it happened. And people who survived, not that people who didn't survive didn't try their darndest, but that people who survived put their lives on the line in a different way. And nobody had it easy. And nothing is ever handed to you. You can't assume that everything you have can't be taken away from you tomorrow. And if that sounds pessimistic, it's just a caution. You know, be prepared. Just know that an illness could rob you of your ability to interact with your family. It could rob you of all your finances. Anything could happen to any of us at any time. And there are people who are heroic, who do their best to rise above it. And I don't know how well I will do, but I'm hoping that if I get challenged, I will rise above it.
Well, and it also sounds like appreciate the time you have, right? With friends and family, which I always appreciate my time with you and learning from
Well,
you.
I love to be with my grandsons. My oldest grandson was with me in Germany this summer, so that was totally meaningful for both of us.
It's amazing.
So don't keep things from your kids. I guess that's another lesson, be open. Let them in.
Well, thank you for letting me in. Thank you for sharing your story and being with me today.
Did the hour go by? Can we do this again?
Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Thanks to Margaret and Michael Valentine for their ongoing support of this series. Managing producer is Ann Thompson, technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kik Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org.